There are moments in life when you think you're standing up for something small, something so ordinary that nobody could possibly take issue with it. And then one day you come home to discover that the smallest act of kindness has somehow turned into a full-blown neighborhood war. Looking back now, I can almost laugh at how ridiculous it all became. But I promise you, when I first saw that pile of broken lumber scattered across my backyard, there wasn't a single funny thought in my head. My name is Ethan Walker, and until this happened, I honestly believed our little subdivision outside Franklin, Tennessee, was about as peaceful as a place could be. We lived at the very end of a quiet cul-de-sac where kids still rode bicycles until sunset. Retirees watered their flowers every evening, and everybody waved as they drove past, even if they barely knew each other. Behind our property sat a narrow stretch of protected woodland that the county called a greenway, though to me it was simply a patch of trees where deer wandered through at dawn, and birds filled the mornings with enough noise to make an alarm clock unnecessary. My wife, Lauren, used to joke that we had bought the house because of the backyard, not because of the house itself, and she wasn't entirely wrong. Every season brought something different out there, but winter always carried one thing that quietly tugged at both of us: the stray cats. Every year they'd start appearing once the temperatures dropped, slipping silently between the trees after dark, keeping their distance from people while searching for some place dry enough to survive another freezing night. Some were skittish, some had old collars from families they'd clearly lost years earlier, and a few looked so young that it was hard not to wonder how they'd ended up alone in the first place. We'd leave out a little food now and then, never enough to create a crowd, just enough to help whichever hungry traveler happened to pass through. I never considered myself an animal rescuer. I wasn't trying to start a sanctuary or become the neighborhood cat guy. I simply hated the idea of watching living creatures shiver through 30-degree nights when I had the ability to make things just a little easier. My dad, Richard, spent nearly 40 years as a carpenter before retiring. And whenever I tackled the project around the house, he'd somehow show up with a truck full of tools before I even finished asking for advice. One Saturday morning, I mentioned building a simple shelter behind the fence where nobody would even notice it, and he smiled the way fathers do when they finally get an excuse to work alongside their grown sons again. By lunchtime, we were sketching ideas on the back of an old hardware receipt. Nothing fancy. Pressure-treated lumber, insulated walls, a sloped roof so rain would run off instead of pooling, clear acrylic flaps to keep the wind out while letting the cats come and go, and plenty of clean straw inside. Dad insisted on overbuilding everything as usual. If we're making it, he laughed while tightening another screw, it'll still be standing when you're collecting Social Security. By Sunday evening, the little shelter looked better than I had imagined. We tucked it just beyond the fence line near the trees, where it blended naturally into the landscape, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Lauren placed fresh straw inside while I set out a shallow bowl of water nearby. And for a couple of days, nothing happened. Then one cold evening, I glanced out the kitchen window and saw a tiny orange tabby cautiously stepping inside. 5 minutes later, it curled into a tight little ball and fell asleep, as if it had finally found someplace safe. I don't know why that image stayed with me, but it did. Over the next several weeks, more cats appeared. A scarred black tom with one torn ear, a gray kitten that couldn't have been more than 6 months old, 2 calicos that seemed inseparable. None of them stayed long, but they all seemed to know the shelter was there whenever the weather turned ugly. Lauren started naming them despite insisting she wouldn't get attached, and before long, we'd find ourselves peeking through the window every evening just to see who had checked into what she jokingly called the Walker Winter Inn. I even shared a few pictures on our neighborhood community page because I genuinely thought people might enjoy seeing something positive for a change. Most comments were exactly what you'd expect. "That's so sweet. Those poor babies. Wish more people cared." A few neighbors even offered extra straw or old blankets. But buried among all the kindness were a handful of comments that felt strangely personal. One woman complained the cats would attract. Another insisted feeding strays lowered property values. Someone else wrote that people who encourage wildlife didn't belong in a planned community. I shrugged it off. Every neighborhood has one or two people who can find a problem with literally anything. I figured the conversation would disappear in a day or two, just like every other argument on that app. I had no idea one person had already decided that my little wooden shelter wasn't just an eyesore, it was a challenge to her authority. And before the following week was over, she'd make sure I understood exactly how far she was willing to go. The next Tuesday answered that question in a way I never expected. I pulled into the driveway just before sunset after another ordinary day at work, already thinking about leftovers and whether the Titans game was worth staying up for. But the second I stepped out of my truck, I saw Lauren standing on the front porch with her arms folded tightly across her chest. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just looked at me for a second before quietly saying, "Don't get mad until you see it." That sentence alone made my stomach drop. I followed her through the gate into the backyard, and for a second my brain refused to process what I was looking at. The shelter was gone. Completely gone. Boards were splintered across the grass. The roof had been smashed into pieces. The straw was soaked from someone dumping a bucket of water over it, and one of the acrylic door panels had cracked clean down the middle. It wasn't weather damage. It wasn't an accident. Somebody had intentionally destroyed every single piece of it. Then I noticed the bright orange notice stapled directly onto my fence with heavy construction staples, almost like they wanted to make sure I'd have to stare at it while cleaning up the mess. Community Vitae violation. Unauthorized animal structure. Daily fine. $250 until corrected. I actually laughed for about 2 seconds because I thought it had to be a joke. Corrected? There wasn't even a shelter left anymore. Whoever destroyed it had already corrected the problem. Lauren told me one of our neighbors, Mr. Hanson from across the circle, had watched 2 landscaping contractors arrive that afternoon with an HOA board member. According to him, they spent maybe 15 minutes tearing everything apart before loading the larger pieces into a trailer. Nobody knocked on our door. Nobody called. Nobody left a warning. They simply decided they had the authority to remove something sitting entirely on our property. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and called the HOA president, Diane Mercer. She answered before the second ring finished. "This is Diane. Did you authorize people to destroy something in my backyard today?" I asked, trying harder than I've ever tried in my life to keep my voice level. There was a pause. Then she sighed as though I were inconveniencing her. "Mr. Walker, we've addressed this issue several times." "No, you haven't," I replied. "I've never received a single written warning about that shelter." "We posted reminders on the community page," she said. "Residents were informed that feeding stray animals violates neighborhood standards." "Posting comments online isn't legal notice," I shot back. "And even if it were, you don't get to trespass on my property and destroy something I built." She gave a little chuckle that still annoys me every time I think about it. "You agreed to HOA covenanters when you bought your home. Community appearance comes before personal preference." I looked down at the broken lumber scattered across my yard. "Appearance?" I asked quietly. "You sent people to smash a wooden shelter with sledgehammers. Now my backyard looks like a tornado hit it." She ignored the point completely. "If you remove all feeding stations and discontinue attracting feral animals, the daily fines may be reviewed." "You destroyed the shelter," I practically shouted. "There is nothing left to remove." "Then perhaps you'll consider this matter resolved," she replied in the calmest voice imaginable before adding, "Good evening, Mr. Walker," and hanging up. I stood there staring at my phone while Lauren slowly shook her head. "She's counting on you losing your temper," she said. "Don't give her that." She was right. Everything about the situation felt designed to provoke exactly that reaction. Instead of throwing the broken boards away, I photographed every angle. Close-ups, wide shots, the staple holes in the fence, tire tracks left by the trailer, the water-soaked straw, even the tiny paw prints still visible in the mud, where one of the cats must return after everything happened. As I worked, Mr. Hanson walked over carrying a flash drive. "Figured you might need this," he said. His security camera overlooked part of our backyard entrance, and while it hadn't captured the actual demolition, It clearly showed two HOA maintenance contractors entering through the side gate before leaving with pieces of the shelter stacked in their trailer. "You didn't get this from me," he whispered. "People around here are afraid of Diane. She likes making examples out of folks." That sentence stuck with me all night. Making examples. Suddenly, this wasn't about stray cats anymore. It was about control. I couldn't sleep. So around midnight, I started reading county ordinances instead of watching television. Buried inside one wildlife resource page, I found references to managed community cat shelters. That surprised me. I dug deeper, found state guidance encouraging humane shelters in certain situations, and finally decided there had to be someone who actually knew the law better than an HOA president who seemed to believe her authority ended somewhere above the Constitution. The next morning, during my lunch break, I called Williamson County Animal Services, expecting to spend 20 minutes on hold before someone politely told me they couldn't help. Instead, the woman who answered listened quietly while I explained everything from beginning to end. She interrupted only once. "Can I ask one question?" she said. "Of course." "Did the association physically remove or destroy the shelter themselves?" "Yes." There was another pause, but this one felt different. I heard keyboard clicks in the background before she spoke again. "Mr. Walker, would you mind emailing us photographs, the violation notice, and any communication you've had with the HOA?" "Sure, but can I ask why?" "Because if what you're describing is accurate," she answered carefully, "this may involve much more than a neighborhood covenant dispute." My heart started beating a little faster. "What do you mean?" "I don't want to speculate before reviewing everything," she replied, "but structures associated with managed community cat programs are treated differently than many people realize, and private organizations don't automatically have authority to interfere with them." I thanked her, hung up, and immediately forwarded every photo, every screenshot, the security footage, and even my phone log showing the call with Diane. Less than 3 hours later, I received another call. This time, it wasn't the receptionist. It was an investigator. He introduced himself as Officer Ben Collins, and after confirming a few details, he ended the conversation with one sentence that completely shifted the balance of the story. "Mr. Walker," he said, "I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't clean up the remaining debris just yet. My partner and I would like to see the scene exactly as they left it." The moment I hung up, I looked over at Lauren, who had been silently listening from across the kitchen. And for the first time since this whole mess began, neither one of us felt helpless anymore. We didn't know exactly what was coming next, but someone outside the HOA had finally started asking the right questions. 2 mornings later, right at 9 o'clock, a white county SUV rolled into our cul-de-sac, followed by another one carrying the Animal Services seal on the doors. You could practically feel curtains moving all over the neighborhood as people peeked through their windows trying to figure out who was in trouble this time. Officer Ben Collins stepped out with his partner, introduced themselves, and spent nearly an hour photographing everything before asking me to walk them through exactly where the shelter had been built, how it had been used, and what had happened the day it disappeared. They measured distances, inspected the debris, reviewed the security footage Mr. Hansen had provided, and even examined the remaining straw and food bowls that had been left untouched. Diane eventually appeared with 2 HOA board members, smiling the kind of smile people wear when they're absolutely convinced they're about to be proven right. "I'm glad the county is here," she announced loudly enough for several nearby neighbors to hear. "We've been trying to explain that unauthorized speeding stations attract nuisance animals." Officer Collins didn't even look up from his clipboard. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "we'll ask questions if we need clarification." Her smile faded just a little. She handed over a folder containing HOA bylaws and repeatedly pointed to sections about neighborhood appearance, landscaping standards, and maintaining property values, but every few minutes the officers would ask the same question in different ways. Did the association obtain permission before entering private property? Was there a county order authorizing removal? Who directed the contractors to demolish the structure? The answers never changed. No permission, no permit, no official order. just an internal decision made by the HOA board. Around noon, the officers gathered everyone near the back fence, and the entire atmosphere shifted. Officer Collins closed his notebook, looked directly at Diane, and spoke with the kind of calm confidence that leaves no room for argument. An HOA has authority to enforce certain community covenants, he began, but it does not have unlimited authority to enter private property and destroy structures without legal authorization. Based on our inspection and the documentation provided, this shelter does not violate county regulations governing managed outdoor cat shelters. Diane immediately interrupted. That's ridiculous. They're stray cats. Collins raised one hand without changing his expression. Whether you personally approve of community cats isn't the issue. The issue is that your association acted outside its authority. For the first time since this nightmare began, the neighborhood was completely silent. Even the people watching from their driveways stopped whispering. The officer continued, explaining that destroying the shelter without following the proper legal process exposed the association to enforcement action and potential civil liability. Then came the sentence. I don't think Diane saw coming in a million years. The county will be issuing a $2,000 administrative penalty to the association for the unauthorized destruction of a protected animal shelter structure. And this report will recommend that any future actions involving similar situations be coordinated through the appropriate county agencies rather than self-enforced. Diane's face turned pale. One of the other board members quietly asked if they could appeal. You're welcome to pursue any remedies available, Collins replied, but today's findings are based on the evidence. Before leaving, he turned toward me and smiled. Mr. Walker, you're free to rebuild your shelter. I would simply recommend documenting the process, and if anyone interferes again, call us before cleaning anything up. As the county vehicles pulled away, several neighbors who had stayed silent through the entire ordeal finally walked over. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner. Others admitted they had been afraid of retaliation from the HOA. Even Mr. Hanson laughed and said, I guess power only lasts until somebody higher up reads the rulebook. Within a month, Diane resigned as HOA president. Officially, it was for personal reasons, but everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly why. A new board was elected, and one of their first decisions was to create a committee that actually worked with residents instead of against them. My dad came back the following weekend carrying the same old toolbox he used for the first time. Round two? He asked with a grin. Round two, I answered. We rebuilt the shelter stronger than before, using better insulation and sturdier lumber. And this time several neighbors showed up to help. Someone donated materials. Another family brought fresh straw. Kids painted small wooden paw prints on the side. And Lauren laughed when she realized the little shelter had somehow become the neighborhood's most popular construction project. Every winter since then, the cats still come and go as they always have. Some stay one night, some stay a week, and every time I see tiny paw prints leading toward that little wooden house, I'm reminded that kindness isn't always convenient, and standing up for it isn't always easy. Looking back, I don't think this story was ever really about cats. It was about what happens when ordinary people stop assuming that loud voices automatically mean they're right. Sometimes the people who act the most confident are simply hoping nobody ever checks whether they actually have the authority they claim. I'd love to hear what you think. Was the HOA simply trying to protect the neighborhood? Or did they cross a line the moment they stepped onto private property and destroyed something that wasn't theirs? If you had been living on that street, whose side would you have taken? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever had a neighborhood dispute that spiraled into something nobody expected, I'd really like to hear your story too. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.